Beatrice smoothed the crisp sheets of the Plaza Hotel suite, her hands rough against the silk. 3 floors down, Nia glided through the ballroom, in a custom Vera Wang gown, drowning in applause. They were in the exact same building on the exact same night. Beatrice was 52, wearing a cheap polyester maid's uniform. Nia was 24, marrying into a wealthy New York empire. Yet when the beautiful bride walked past the tired maid in the hallway, she looked right through her. Nia pretended the woman who gave her life simply did not exist. Beatrice's hands carried a specific stubborn scent. It was a sharp chemical mix of industrial bleach, ammonia, and lemon polish. It was the undeniable smell of invisible labor. Tonight, that harsh scent clashed violently with the air in the 7th floor hallway of the plaza. The corridor was heavy with Baccarat Rouge blooming orchids and expensive champagne. Wealthy guests brushed past her housekeeping cart without a second glance. To them, she was just another piece of the hotel furniture, a silent, aging shadow dressed in a crisp, cheap grey uniform. She did not have a gold-foiled invitation to the grand ballroom downstairs. Her name was not written in elegant calligraphy on any seating chart. Mothers of the bride usually sat at the head table. They wore custom silk dresses and wiped away tears of joy with laced handkerchiefs. Beatrice wore rubber-soled safety shoes and wiped away smudges from hallway mirrors with microfiber cloths. She had begged her floor supervisor for this specific Saturday night shift. She traded 2 weekends of grueling overtime just to be assigned to this exact floor. She did it just to catch a passing glimpse of her own daughter. Beatrice pushed her heavy cart over the thick patterned carpet. The wheels squeaked faintly, a steady rhythm she had known for over 20 years. Every push of a cart, every scrubbed bathtub had a mathematical purpose. Nia was smart, brilliant even, and brilliant girls belonged at places like Columbia University. But Ivy League dreams came with crushing, astronomical price tags. Beatrice had calculated exactly how many hotel rooms it took to buy a single semester of textbooks. She knew exactly how many double night shifts equaled a campus meal plan. She had cleaned thousands of rooms over those long years. She stripped unmade beds, folded heavy towels, and scrubbed strangers' messes on her hands and knees. Her hands became permanently calloused, the knuckles permanently swollen and stiff from the hot water. But she never once complained. She honestly thought she was building a sturdy bridge for her daughter, a bridge for Nia to cross into a much better, safer life. She did not realize that once Nia crossed that bridge, she would immediately burn it down. She would completely erase the woman who had laid the heavy bricks. Downstairs, the live jazz band started playing a slow, sweeping melody. The elegant music echoed faintly up the grand curving staircase. Beatrice stopped her cart near a polished brass wall sconce and closed her eyes. She let herself imagine just for a fleeting second that she was down there, that she was holding a delicate crystal glass of wine, smiling warmly at the groom's wealthy family. But the cold, hard metal of the cart handle grounded her quickly back to reality. This was her place, and that was Nia's world. She had quietly accepted her heartbreaking role as the hidden secret. She was perfectly willing to stay upstairs, entirely out of sight. She was prepared to love her daughter silently from the cold shadows of the hallway. But here is where it gets interesting. Fate, it seems, has a strange way of forcing buried secrets out into the glaring light. Beatrice reached slowly into the deep pocket of her apron. Her stiff fingers brushed against a small, slightly crumpled piece of paper. It was a clipping from a local New York newspaper announcing the high society engagement. It was the only piece of the wedding she was actually allowed to own. She kept it folded perfectly, a tiny, fragile treasure hidden beneath the bleach and the dust rags. She pulled out a fresh towel to wipe the brass fixture once again. She had to look busy, just in case the strict floor manager walked by. The 7th floor was the exclusive VIP suite level. It was supposed to be completely quiet, while the reception raged on loudly below. Room 714 was the grand bridal suite, reserved specially for the newlyweds. Beatrice was assigned to ensure the long corridor remained absolutely spotless. She moved methodically, smoothing her uniform, purposefully keeping her head down. It was the absolute cardinal rule of her invisible job: never make direct eye contact with the high-paying guests. Did Naya ever think about her on a day like today? When the beautiful bride looked in the mirror this morning, did she see her mother's tired eyes? Looking back, Beatrice swallowed the heavy, bitter lump forming in her throat. She told herself that Nia's happiness was more than enough. Even if that exact happiness required Beatrice to be entirely invisible forever. She took a deep, shaky breath of the perfume-heavy air. The hallway was empty, bathed in the soft, warm glow of expensive crystal chandeliers. Beatrice leaned against her cart for just a moment to rest her deeply aching back. It was a very long shift, and the night was still far from over. She thought she was entirely safe up here in the quiet solitude. She thought she could just do her job and go home to her empty apartment. But she was terribly wrong. Downstairs in the grand ballroom, the music was becoming completely deafening. Guests were laughing loudly and clinking their expensive champagne flutes in endless toasts. Nia desperately needed a moment of absolute silence. Her phone was buzzing relentlessly inside her small beaded clutch with an urgent call. She needed a quiet space to complain to her planner about a missing floral arrangement. She slipped out through the heavy mahogany doors and left the glittering party behind. The hallway air was cool and blissfully silent compared to the chaotic ballroom. Nia walked quickly across the thick carpet in her uncomfortable designer heels. She headed straight for the secluded VIP wing, an area strictly off-limits to regular guests. She wanted to make sure nobody could hear her losing her temper tonight. She turned the corner sharply while staring intensely down at her glowing phone screen. She assumed she owned the entire floor and did not bother to look up. Beatrice was moving in the exact opposite direction toward the elevators. She gripped the cold metal handle of her supply cart with both tired hands. She was simply trying to finish her final sweep of the restricted 7th floor corridor. She pushed the heavy load forward blindly, completely unaware of who was rapidly approaching. The wheels made a soft, dull squeak against the floorboards underneath the carpet. She stepped out from the deep shadow of an alcove, just as the bride rushed forward. The heavy housekeeping cart accidentally clipped a massive floral display in the narrow hall. Nia collided roughly into the side of the metal frame and stumbled backward. Her phone slipped from her perfectly manicured fingers and fell onto the soft carpet. She gasped loudly in sudden anger and frantically brushed off her pristine Vera Wang gown. She immediately opened her mouth to shout viciously at the supposedly clumsy hotel worker. She was entirely ready to demand an immediate firing until her angry eyes finally met the maid's face. Time seemed to stop entirely in that dimly lit luxury corridor. Beatrice froze completely, her hands gripping the cart so hard her knuckles turned white. For one split second, a wave of pure, overwhelming joy washed over the mother. She was finally seeing her beautiful daughter up close on her wedding day. She instinctively took a step forward, her lips parting to whisper a sweet, familiar greeting. But what happened next would completely shatter her fragile hopes into pieces. Nia did not smile back at the woman who had sacrificed everything for her. There was no secret moment of shared happiness or gentle recognition between mother and daughter. Instead, all the vibrant color instantly drained from the beautiful bride's flawless face. Nia's expression rapidly morphed from mild annoyance into pure, unadulterated terror. She looked exactly like someone who had just seen a dangerous ghost. Panic flared wildly in Nia's wide, anxiously darting eyes. She immediately looked frantically over her shoulder to check the long, empty hallway. She was desperately scanning the shadows to see if any of her wealthy new in-laws had followed her upstairs. Her breathing became shallow and rapid as she realized the massive, undeniable danger. Her perfectly constructed elite socialite persona was standing right next to a dirty trash cart. The hidden reality of her past was suddenly threatening to destroy her glamorous new future. Nia did not hesitate for a single second before grabbing Beatrice tightly by the upper arm. Her sharp acrylic nails dug painfully into the older woman's thin, cheap grey uniform. She aggressively dragged her terrified mother out of the main corridor and into the deep shadows. This secluded dark corner was located right next to the massive double doors of room 714. It was the lavish bridal suite, reserved exclusively for her very special wedding night. Nia pushed her mother violently against the wall and checked the hallway to ensure absolute privacy. Her beautiful face immediately twisted into an incredibly ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She kept her angry voice down to a shockingly harsh and venomous whisper. She demanded to know if Beatrice was intentionally trying to sabotage her entire new perfect life. Every single word she hissed felt exactly like a sharp physical slap to the face. Beatrice stood completely frozen, with her back pressed tightly against the elegant floral hotel wallpaper. She gently reached out, a calloused, shaking hand, to touch the delicate lace veil of the angry stranger. Nia violently slapped that tired, hard-working hand away, without a single moment of hesitation. She stepped back in absolute horror, as if Beatrice were carrying a highly contagious, deadly disease. She pointed a trembling finger directly at the cheap and dirty grey housekeeping uniform. She frantically reminded Beatrice about the incredibly elite social status of her wealthy new husband. Marcus came from a highly prestigious family of powerful international diplomats and politicians. What would that high society think if they actually knew the beautiful bride's mother cleaned dirty toilets for a living? Beatrice desperately tried to speak through the heavy, painful lump forming in her tight throat. She softly explained that she had worked exhausting double shifts just to be standing here tonight. She promised she only wanted to stand quietly in the shadows and watch her beautiful little girl. The desperate, unconditional love in the older woman's broken voice was completely heartbreaking to hear. Any normal human being would have broken down crying hysterically at that exact vulnerable moment. But Nia had entirely replaced her human heart with a burning, selfish desire for social status. The angry bride crossed her arms tightly over her expensive custom silk Vera Wang wedding gown. She firmly believed they were completely isolated in that quiet, empty part of the massive hotel. But here is where the tense situation gets incredibly interesting for everyone involved. Now listen carefully to this absolutely crucial and easily missed little detail. The heavy oak door of room 714 was not actually locked securely shut. It was left slightly ajar, allowing a thin slice of warm yellow light to quietly spill onto the carpet. Nia was completely and utterly oblivious to the glowing crack in the heavy wooden door. She looked directly into her crying mother's deeply lined and thoroughly exhausted red eyes. She cruelly told Beatrice that she was a humiliating, dirty stain on her perfect new life. She boldly declared that she was an orphan as far as her wealthy new family knew. She strictly ordered the woman who gave her life to never dare to claim her as a daughter again. It was a brutal and highly calculated assassination of a mother's pure, unconditional love. Then, the beautiful bride aggressively snapped open her sparkling designer evening clutch. She quickly dug past her expensive lipstick to pull out a crisp $100 bill. She did not hand it respectfully to the heartbroken woman standing right in front of her. Instead, she tossed it carelessly onto the top of the dirty metal housekeeping supply cart. The green money landed right next to a damp rag, smelling strongly of cheap lemon polish. She coldly ordered Beatrice to take the cash and leave through the hidden service elevator immediately to avoid detection. Beatrice stared down blindly at the green paper, resting heavily on her metal supply cart. Her chest physically ached in complete agony, as if her fragile ribs were suddenly cracking apart. She had scrubbed 1,000 dirty hotel floors just to buy that ungrateful girl a better life. Her ultimate reward for decades of sacrifice was a discarded bill and a cruel demand to disappear forever. Nia sharply turned her back on her weeping mother without a single ounce of genuine regret. She adjusted her diamond earrings and confidently walked back to her glamorous fake life, leaving the broken maid alone. The crisp $100 bill sat perfectly still on the scratched metal cart. It looked entirely out of place next to the cheap plastic spray bottles and damp rags. Nia genuinely believed that specific piece of money was a generous final payoff. She thought she was simply buying her mother's permanent silence for the entire evening. She confidently assumed a poor hotel maid would eagerly snatch up the cash and quietly disappear into the service elevator. But the real secret is much deeper and more painful than a single piece of paper. Beatrice had not just sneaked onto this specific luxury floor merely to catch a stolen glance of her beautiful daughter. That was only a very small fraction of her desperate, deeply hidden plan. For the past 6 grueling months, she had been quietly working brutal, exhausting double shifts. She eagerly picked up every single discarded weekend shift and scrubbed every late-night spill without complaint. She completely ruined her already aching back and permanently destroyed her worn-out knees in the process. She did all of this to secretly gather exactly $8,000 in loose, crumpled cash. That massive, life-changing sum was specifically designated for the extravagant imported white orchids currently decorating the grand ballroom. Nia had foolishly ordered those extremely expensive floral arrangements on a hidden high-interest credit card. She wanted to desperately impress her wealthy new in-laws with a lavish, completely flawless aesthetic. She had no real way to actually pay that massive crushing bill when it finally arrived next month. Beatrice had secretly found the terrifying overdue invoice accidentally mailed to her tiny, cramped old apartment. A fiercely loving mother never wants her only child to start a brand new life, drowning in secret heavy debt. So Beatrice walked right into the upscale Manhattan florist exactly 3 days ago, wearing her cheap, frayed winter coat. She quietly placed a thick, incredibly heavy envelope of crinkled $20 bills right on their polished glass counter. She completely paid off her daughter's reckless, superficial vanity in full with cold, hard cash. She essentially bought those incredibly beautiful white orchids with her own sweat, blood, and invisible back-breaking labor. And now she was standing completely alone in the dark hallway looking down at a single $100 bill. Her own successful daughter had just tossed it at her like she was a dirty, bothersome beggar on the street. The cruel, undeniable irony felt exactly like a sharp, jagged knife twisting deeply into her fragile chest. She had literally bought the very flowers that Nia was proudly showing off to the elite society downstairs. Yet, she was not even allowed to breathe the same air as those wealthy wedding guests. Beatrice slowly reached out her trembling, heavily calloused hand toward the metal supply cart. She absolutely did not pick up the crisp money her daughter had so heartlessly discarded. Instead, she just gripped the cold plastic handle of her chemical spray bottle. She squeezed her tired eyes tightly shut, trying desperately to hold back the hot, burning tears. She felt entirely broken and utterly defeated in the shadows of the Plaza Hotel. But what happened next in that quiet hallway would completely change everything. Inside room 714, the lighting was soft and dim. Elias leaned back in the heavy velvet armchair and let out a long, weary sigh. The primary reception downstairs was loud, flashy, and honestly quite draining for a man of his age. He had built his entire business empire from nothing but dirt and determination. He preferred quiet corners and real conversations over the shallow glitter of the elite Manhattan crowd. He closed his eyes for just a moment to regain his strength before the formal dinner began. The grand bridal suite was supposed to be a completely silent sanctuary. It was tucked far away from the clinking glasses and the constant fake laughter of the party. Elias had come up here specifically to escape the noise and check a few work emails in peace. But the heavy, ornate wooden door had not quite clicked shut when the hotel staff left earlier. It was standing just a few inches open, creating a narrow gap into the dim hallway outside. Suddenly, a sharp and aggressive sound broke the perfect stillness of the room. Elias sat up instantly, his sharp instincts immediately on high alert. He heard the unmistakable muffled sound of a desperate struggle followed by heavy dragging footsteps. Then a voice cut through the air that made his entire body go cold. It was Naya's voice, but it wasn't the sweet melodic tone she used in front of the cameras. This was something different. It was sharp, cold, and dripping with an incredible amount of pure, unfiltered venom. He listened as his future daughter-in-law began her brutal and calculated attack. He heard her call another human being a dirty stain on her perfect new life. He heard the disgusting, elitist insults thrown at a woman who was clearly suffering in silence. Elias felt a deep physical knot tightening in his stomach as the cruelty continued to escalate. He was a man who valued character above all else. He had spent his whole life fighting against people who looked down on the working class. Now listen carefully to what happened next, because it changed the entire course of that evening. Elias heard the unmistakable, heart-wrenching sound of a woman softly sobbing. It was the kind of quiet, broken crying that only comes from a mother's shattered heart. He heard Nia's final, brutal declaration of being an orphan to the world. Then, he heard the sharp metallic clink of a cart being hit by something. He heard the crisp rustle of a bill being tossed like garbage at a beggar. But here is where it gets really interesting for Nia. She thought she was entirely alone in that dark corner of the hotel. She believed her cruel secrets were safely buried in the shadows, where nobody could ever find them. She had no idea that the most powerful man in the building was sitting just 3 feet away. Elias wasn't just Marcus's father. He was the primary donor to the foundation Nia was desperate to join. He was the very gatekeeper to the high society world she was so aggressively chasing. Elias stood up slowly from the armchair, his movements deliberate and filled with a quiet, dangerous energy. He adjusted the sleeve of his expensive tuxedo jacket with a steady hand. He looked at the narrow gap in the door, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. He wasn't just a guest at this wedding anymore. He was a judge who had just heard a devastating confession of character. He realized that the beautiful woman his son was about to marry was a total stranger. The room felt smaller now, charged with the weight of the truth he had just discovered. He thought about his own mother, who had spent decades scrubbing office floors in Chicago. He thought about the pride he felt for her every single day of his life. He looked at his polished shoes, and then at the door leading to the hallway. Nia's laughter drifted back from the distance as she returned to the ballroom. She had no idea that the real celebration was already over. Elias took a single firm step toward the door, his shadow stretching long across the plush carpet. He reached for the handle, his fingers hovering over the cold, polished brass for a heartbeat. He knew that what he was about to do would likely ruin the most expensive night of Nia's life. He didn't care about the cost of the flowers or the price of the cake anymore. He only cared about the woman who was currently weeping alone in the dark. He paused for a final second, his mind flashing back to the sound of that bill hitting the cart. It was the sound of someone who had completely forgotten where they came from. It was the sound of a heart that had become hopelessly lost in the pursuit of glitter and gold. Elias finally gripped the handle and pulled the door wide open. The hallway light flooded into the room, but the darkness in his eyes was much, much deeper. He realized that sometimes the most important part of a wedding happens long the vows are spoken. Beatrice was still there, leaning against her cart, her shoulders shaking with silent, agonizing grief. She looked small, broken, and entirely defeated by her own daughter's cruelty. Elias stepped out into the hallway, his presence filling the narrow space with an undeniable authority. He didn't say a word to Nia, who was already far away in the ballroom. He only looked at the maid and the discarded $100 bill. He realized that Nia had just made the most expensive mistake of her entire life. The heavy oak door of room 714 did not just simply open to the quiet hallway. It swung wide with a loud, commanding thud against the expensive floral hotel wallpaper. The sudden violent noise echoed sharply down the quiet, dimly lit luxury corridor. Naya instantly flinched and whipped her head around in absolute freezing panic. Her cruel, scowling face practically vanished in a fraction of a terrifying split second. She realized someone had been sitting right there in the dark shadows, listening to everything. She immediately recognized the tall, imposing figure of her very wealthy future father-in-law. Her elite socialite survival instincts kicked in without a single moment of hesitation. She desperately forced a bright, perfectly practiced smile onto her pale, terrified face. She smoothly stepped directly in front of her quietly weeping mother to block his view. She acted like she was just dealing with a minor annoying inconvenience before the reception. Nia let out a light, breathy laugh that sounded entirely fake and incredibly nervous. She quickly lied and claimed this clearly confused maid was aggressively harassing her for extra cash tips. She confidently expected Elias to immediately call hotel security and have the dirty woman removed. She naturally assumed wealthy, powerful men always sided instantly with their own exclusive protective circle. She thought her flawless, innocent bride routine was working perfectly to cover up the ugly mess. But watch closely what happens next, because the situation completely flips upside down. Elias did not return her warm, practiced smile, or even offer a polite, acknowledging nod. He did not even look at his son's beautiful bride standing right in front of him. His stern, aged face was completely unreadable and utterly terrifying in its absolute heavy stillness. He stepped completely out of the bridal suite and walked directly toward the two tense women. Nia nervously stepped aside, fully expecting him to aggressively yell at the crying housekeeper for trespassing. But Elias walked right past the custom Vera Wang gown, as if it were totally invisible to him. He completely ignored the frantic, desperate lies spilling quickly from the young poor bride's trembling mouth. He stopped directly in front of the scratched metal supply cart parked against the wall. He looked down at the damp cleaning rag, smelling strongly of cheap industrial lemon polish. He slowly reached out his large, strong hand toward the top of the messy cart. Elias carefully picked up the crisp $100 bill Naya had callously thrown away. He held the green paper thoughtfully between his fingers for a very long, deeply uncomfortable moment. Then he finally lifted his intense gaze and looked directly at the trembling Beatrice. He absolutely did not see a dirty, bothersome hotel worker trying to ruin a glamorous Manhattan wedding. He looked deeply into her red, exhausted eyes and saw decades of quiet, back-breaking maternal sacrifice. He saw the swollen knuckles and the permanently tired shoulders of a truly devoted, selfless mother. The absolute silence in the hallway was heavier than any angry spoken words could ever possibly be. The grand, expensive illusion Naya had carefully built was officially starting to permanently collapse right now. The heavy oak door of room 714 did not just simply open. It swung wide and hit the floral wallpaper with a loud thud. That sudden noise echoed sharply down the quiet hotel hallway. Naya instantly jumped and spun around in absolute panic. Her cruel expression vanished in a fraction of a second when she realized someone had been inside the entire time. She immediately recognized the tall, imposing figure stepping out into the light. It was Elias, her extremely wealthy future father-in-law, standing right there. Her elite survival instincts kicked in without a single moment of hesitation. She desperately forced a perfectly practiced smile onto her pale face. She smoothly stepped right in front of her weeping mother to block his view. She desperately needed to control the narrative before it completely destroyed her. Nia acted like she was just dealing with a minor, everyday annoyance. She let out a light laugh that sounded completely fake and terribly nervous. She quickly lied and pointed a manicured finger directly at Beatrice. She told Elias that this confused maid was aggressively harassing her in the hallway. She claimed the crazy woman was desperately begging for extra cash tips. She insisted she was just trying to get away to join the party. She played the helpless, innocent bride perfectly to manipulate the situation. She confidently expected Elias to immediately pull out his phone and call security. She naturally assumed powerful men always sided with their own exclusive circle. She thought the hotel worker would be fired and dragged away instantly. She honestly thought her flawless performance had saved her glamorous new life. But what happened next will completely surprise you. Elias did not return her warm, practiced smile. He did not offer a polite nod of understanding. He did not say a single comforting word to the young, nervous bride. In fact, he did not even look at Nia at all. He walked right past her expensive Vera Wang gown, like she was entirely invisible. He completely ignored the frantic lies spilling from her trembling mouth. It was the ultimate display of silent rejection. He stopped directly in front of the scratched metal housekeeping supply cart. He looked down at the damp rag, smelling strongly of cheap lemon polish. He slowly reached out his steady hand toward the top of the cart. Elias carefully picked up the crisp $100 bill Nia had callously thrown away. He held that green paper thoughtfully between his fingers for a long time. Then he finally lifted his intense gaze to look at the other woman. He looked directly at the trembling mother in the cheap grey uniform. He absolutely did not see a bothersome hotel worker trying to ruin a wedding. He looked deeply into Beatrice's red, exhausted eyes. He saw decades of quiet, back-breaking maternal sacrifice staring right back at him. The absolute silence in that hallway was heavier than any angry words. Nia stood frozen behind him, while her fake smile slowly melted away into pure dread. The expensive illusion she had carefully built was officially starting to collapse. Elias stood tall, holding the discarded money tightly in his hand. He was finally ready to break his silence and change everything. Elias stood in the quiet hallway with the crumpled $100 bill tightly in his hand. He finally turned his sharp gaze away from the exhausted mother and looked directly at the trembling bride. Nia took a nervous step back under the heavy weight of his uncompromising stare. She quickly opened her mouth to repeat her desperate lie about the aggressive hotel maid. But Elias simply raised a single finger, and her voice instantly died in her throat. He did not yell or raise his deep voice, which made his quiet words even more terrifying. He told Nia to stop insulting his intelligence with such painfully obvious and pathetic lies. He calmly stated that he had heard every single cruel word she had hissed in the shadows. Nia's face flushed a deep, embarrassed red as her flawless facade completely shattered into jagged pieces. She stammered out a weak, desperate defense about trying to protect the prestigious reputation of his family. She cried that she only wanted to fit into their elite, high society world without bringing them shame. She honestly believed that wealthy people only respected other wealthy people with perfect pedigrees. Elias let out a low, bitter chuckle that completely lacked any real humor. He looked at the expensive Vera Wang gown and the glittering diamonds around her neck. He explained that she had completely misunderstood what his family actually valued in a human being. They did not care about fake blue blood or imaginary aristocratic family trees. They cared about integrity, unyielding loyalty, and how a person treats those who have absolutely nothing. He firmly stated that lying about her own mother was a massive, unforgivable red flag. It was a glaring indicator of a rotten and deeply flawed moral character. A person who easily discards their own family for social status cannot ever be trusted with a business empire. How could she possibly honor her sacred wedding vows if she could not even honor her own mother? She had fundamentally mistaken superficial wealth for actual, undeniable human class. True class is never about the expensive designer labels you wear on your back to impress strangers. It is always about the heavy burdens you are willing to carry for the people you love. Now listen carefully to this part, because it completely destroys the myth of high society. Elias explained that his family's massive fortune was not simply inherited from old money elites. It was built entirely on grueling labor, countless sleepless nights, and dirty, calloused hands. He pointed directly at Beatrice, whose quiet dignity radiated right through her cheap grey uniform. He declared that this hard-working maid had infinitely more class than the bride standing before him. Beatrice had sacrificed her own body and comfort to give her daughter a brilliant future. Nia had taken that beautiful, selfless gift and completely twisted it into something ugly and shameful. She had foolishly traded genuine, unconditional love for a fleeting moment of fake societal approval. Elias held up the crisp $100 bill so it caught the warm hallway light. He told Nia that this piece of paper was not a generous tip or a clever bribe. It was the exact pathetic price she had placed on her own soul. She had sold out her loving mother just for a temporary spot at a fancy dinner table. Elias then reminded her about the core mission of their prestigious family charity foundation. The entire organization was dedicated to uplifting the working class and supporting struggling single mothers. How could Nia possibly sit on that board and pretend to care about the less fortunate? How could she give speeches about empowerment while her own mother scrubbed toilets in absolute secret? The staggering hypocrisy of her actions was completely sickening to the older businessman. He demanded to know how she planned to live with such a massive, toxic lie. The young bride began to cry, but they were no longer tears of manipulation. They were tears of absolute, crushing realization, as her entire worldview was brutally dismantled. She had spent years desperately running away from her humble working-class roots. She thought hiding her truth would finally make her worthy of the elite Manhattan lifestyle. Instead, that exact deception had just proven she was completely unworthy of joining his family. Elias did not offer her a tissue or a single word of soft comfort. He looked at her with a cold, piercing disappointment that cut deeper than any sharp knife. He was a seasoned businessman who knew exactly how to spot a terrible investment from a mile away. Right now, the beautiful woman standing in front of him looked like a total emotional bankruptcy. He needed a daughter-in-law who could lead his family's legacy with true, undeniable strength. He certainly did not need a shallow socialite who threw her mother away like common trash. Elias took a deep, steadying breath and let the heavy silence settle over the hallway. He stopped looking at the terrified bride and turned his full attention back to Beatrice. He looked carefully at her worn, heavy work boots and the faded seams of her cheap grey uniform. His deep voice suddenly lost its sharp, angry edge and became remarkably soft and deeply reflective. He told Nia that she had completely misunderstood what real power actually looks like in this country. She desperately thought it was about wearing designer dresses and aggressively hiding any trace of human struggle. She was entirely tragically wrong about the true nature of wealth. He slowly told her a very personal story about the brutal, freezing winters on the south side of Chicago. Elias absolutely did not grow up in a luxury penthouse with a massive, endless trust fund waiting for him. He grew up in a tiny, terribly drafty apartment where the rusty radiator barely ever worked in December. His own mother worked the grueling graveyard shift at a massive corporate office building right in downtown Chicago. Every single night, she put on a stiff, uncomfortable uniform, exactly like the one Beatrice was wearing right now. She rode the freezing city bus in the dark, just to clean up the messes of wealthy strangers. But here is where the story gets truly important for you to understand. Now listen carefully to the actual hidden cost of a successful American dream. Elias quietly explained how his mother spent 30 long years strictly on her hands and knees. She scrubbed endless rows of dirty office toilets and polished massive marble lobbies for powerful, demanding executives. She permanently ruined her lower back and completely destroyed her joints just to afford his expensive college tuition. She physically broke her own body piece by piece, so her only son would never have to break his. She was the ultimate unspoken hero of his entire life story. He passionately told Nia that he never once felt a single ounce of shame about her invisible, difficult labor. On the day he finally opened his very first major company headquarters, his mother was his absolute guest of honor. He proudly held her, heavily calloused, scarred hands in front of every single wealthy investor in that crowded, opulent room. He wanted every billionaire standing there to know exactly who had built the man they were doing business with. He knew those rough, damaged hands were the absolute, undeniable foundation of his entire financial empire. He respected her sweat and daily sacrifice significantly more than any massive stock portfolio. Elias turned his intense dark eyes back to the crying young bride standing frozen against the hallway wall. The glaring contrast between his immense vocal pride and her pathetic hidden shame was incredibly sickening for him to witness. He delivered his final devastating verdict with absolute unshakable conviction in the quiet, dim corridor. He looked at the discarded $100 bill, then at Naya's flawless makeup, and spoke his ultimate truth. "A person who feels ashamed of the hands that raised them," he said quietly, "will never know how to cherish anything else." He let those heavy, profound words hang in the air to completely crush her guilty conscience. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not have to. His quiet tone was far more devastating than any loud, angry shouting could ever be. He stood incredibly tall in that dim hotel corridor. He looked down at the trembling, silent bride. Nia was clutching her expensive silk dress. Her perfectly manicured fingers were shaking violently. She desperately hoped a quick, tearful apology might somehow save her. She thought she could just say sorry and go back to the glittering party. But Elias was not a man who accepted empty, meaningless words. He dealt entirely in actions and their direct, heavy consequences. He calmly brought up the prestigious family charity foundation. This was the exact social position Nia had desperately craved for many months. It was a highly exclusive, invite-only board of wealthy Manhattan elites. She had already bragged about her upcoming board seat to all her jealous society friends. She had even bought a brand new designer wardrobe just for the upscale charity galas. It was her ultimate golden ticket into the very highest tier of New York society. Elias looked at her with absolutely zero pity in his dark, assessing eyes. He officially informed her that the prominent board seat was no longer hers. He completely revoked her highly coveted position with one single quiet sentence. He explained his undeniable logic with brutal surgical precision. The entire purpose of their family foundation was to help struggling working-class families. They specifically raised millions of dollars to support exhausted single mothers exactly like Beatrice. He asked her a very simple, incredibly sharp question. How could she possibly sit at a velvet-draped banquet table and pretend to care about poor women? How could she smile for the press cameras while her own mother scrubbed dirty toilets in secret? The sheer blinding hypocrisy of it was completely unacceptable to him. He stated that a person who casually throws their own mother away like garbage has absolutely nothing to offer the world. They certainly have no real place making important decisions for a charitable organization. Nia physically flinched backward as if he had actually struck her across the face. Losing that elite board seat was a massive, humiliating social blow. It was a brutal, invisible punishment that completely stripped away her fake, aristocratic armor. She had sacrificed her own mother for social power, and now she had lost both. But here is where it gets incredibly interesting. Now listen carefully to his final, most devastating point. The charity foundation was merely the first consequence of her terrible actions. Elias was not completely finished dismantling her perfect fake life. He shifted his intense focus to the extravagant wedding reception waiting downstairs. He thought about his only son, Marcus, who was currently smiling and greeting oblivious guests. Marcus was a genuinely good, honest man who believed he was marrying his beautiful soulmate. Elias told Nia to think very carefully about the heavy gold ring waiting on a velvet pillow. He told her to truly consider the sacred lifelong vows she was about to make in front of a priest. He bluntly asked her if she honestly believed she was still worthy of stepping back into that grand ballroom. He did not explicitly tell her the expensive wedding was officially cancelled. He did something far more psychologically painful and profound. He placed the entire, crushing weight of that massive decision squarely on her own guilty shoulders. He ordered her to take a long, hard look in the nearest hallway mirror. He wanted her to look past the flawless makeup and the expensive, sparkling diamonds. He challenged her to deeply reflect on the dark, ugly emptiness hiding inside her own heart. Could she really look a good man in the eye and promise to love him in sickness and in health? Could she honestly vow to honor his family when she had so brutally betrayed her own? Elias told her that a marriage built on a foundation of toxicity would inevitably collapse and crush them both. He told her to stay exactly right there in the dark hallway. He told her to figure out if she was a woman capable of real love or just a shallow, heartless actress playing a desperate role. If she was only an actress, he strongly suggested she quietly leave through the service exit before she ruined his son's life forever. The heavy choice was entirely hers to make. Elias finally turned his back on the completely devastated bride. He had delivered his heavy verdict without a single drop of malice. It was just the cold, unfiltered truth, leaving Nia completely paralyzed in the shadows. The heavy tension in the hallway was suddenly broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. Marcus was walking quickly down the dim corridor. He looked sharp in his custom-tailored tuxedo. He had left the loud reception downstairs, specifically to find his father and his bride. He fully expected to find them chatting happily in the bridal suite. Instead, he walked right into a frozen, devastating scene of absolute heartbreak. He slowed his steady pace as he took in the strange, incredibly tense picture. His powerful father was standing silently with a cold expression. His flawless bride was leaning against the floral wallpaper, weeping uncontrollably. And a quiet hotel maid in a cheap grey uniform was standing near a metal cart, looking completely broken. Marcus immediately asked what on earth was going on. Elias did not sugarcoat a single thing for his son. He did not try to soften the brutal truth of the situation. He calmly summarized everything he had just witnessed in the shadows. He told Marcus exactly how Nia had spoken to her own mother. He pointed to the crushed $100 bill and explained what it meant. Marcus stood perfectly still, absorbing the heavy, sickening reality of the woman he loved. Nia immediately lunged forward and desperately grabbed her fiancé's tuxedo sleeve. Her manicured hands were shaking wildly against the dark fabric. She sobbed and desperately begged Marcus to understand her side of the story. She cried that she was just so incredibly scared of losing him. She claimed she was terrified he would reject her if he knew her real background. She pleaded for his pity, hoping his deep love would blind him to her cruelty. Now listen very carefully to how the young groom responded. He did not immediately scream at her or call off the lavish wedding right then and there. He did not throw a massive fit in the middle of the luxury hotel, but the profound disappointment in his dark eyes was incredibly painful to witness. It was a quiet, deep sadness that honestly hurts much worse than explosive anger. He gently but firmly pulled his arm away from her desperate grip. He looked down at Nia and told her she had completely misjudged his heart. He fell in love with her brilliant mind and her fierce drive. He never cared about her bank account or her imaginary elite family tree. But watching her treat another human being like garbage, that was something he could barely stomach, especially when that human being was the very reason she was standing there at all. Here is where the dynamic shifts entirely. Marcus did not keep looking at his weeping, panicked bride. He turned his back on her and walked straight past the expensive Vera Wang dress. He walked right up to the exhausted woman standing awkwardly by the cleaning cart. He looked down at Beatrice's swollen red hands gripping the plastic spray bottle. He reached out slowly and did something incredibly powerful. He gently took both of her rough, calloused hands in his own. He did not care about the harsh smell of industrial bleach. He simply held the hands that had scrubbed 1,000 floors to build his bride's future. He looked the broken mother right in the eyes with absolute unwavering respect. Marcus gently squeezed Beatrice's trembling hands. He did not quickly let go like he was holding something dirty. He held her rough fingers with incredible, genuine warmth. He quietly told her that she was not going anywhere near the service elevator tonight. Elias stepped completely out of the doorway of room 714 to join them. He gave his son a slow, incredibly proud nod of absolute approval. They did not need to speak a single word to agree on what had to happen next. They had silently made a massive, life-altering decision together in that dimly lit hallway. Beatrice immediately tried to pull her aching hands away from the wealthy young groom in complete panic. She frantically shook her head and desperately whispered that she was entirely filthy from her long shift. She pointed frantically to the dark chemical stains permanently marking her cheap, faded grey uniform. She insisted her place was hidden away, pushing the heavy metal cleaning cart, not attending a luxury party. She honestly believed she would absolutely ruin the perfect, expensive aesthetic of the high society wedding. She was entirely ready to shrink back into the cold, familiar shadows where she thought she belonged. But Marcus was absolutely not going to allow that to happen. He reached up and smoothly unbuttoned his custom-tailored, incredibly expensive black tuxedo jacket. He slid the heavy, luxurious silk garment off his broad shoulders with one fluid, elegant motion. He gently draped the beautiful jacket securely around Beatrice's small, trembling, overworked shoulders. The rich, dark fabric perfectly covered the ugly chemical stains on her cheap polyester maid's uniform. It was a profoundly powerful, undeniably physical gesture of total protection and absolute respect. Elias immediately stepped forward and respectfully offered the exhausted housekeeper his strong right arm. He did not treat her like an embarrassing, dirty secret that needed to be hidden away. He treated her exactly like a highly honored, incredibly distinguished VIP guest of the prestigious family. Marcus warmly took Beatrice's left arm, offering his own solid, comforting support on her other side. The two incredibly powerful, wealthy men stood tall, completely flanking the small, tired woman in the middle. They created a totally unbreakable, fiercely protective human wall, entirely around the broken mother. Now listen carefully to the beautiful poetry of this specific, unforgettable moment. Beatrice was no longer just an invisible, nameless maid pushing a heavy garbage cart in the dark. She was suddenly the most fiercely guarded and highly respected woman in the entire Plaza Hotel. The three of them began to slowly walk down the thick, patterned carpet of the luxury hallway. They left Nia standing completely alone in the cold shadows, next to the discarded $100 bill. They walked straight toward the heavy mahogany doors, leading to the grand, glittering ballroom. The loud jazz music grew incredibly clear and vibrant as they approached the main reception area. Beatrice's rubber-soled work boots made no sound against the thick, expensive hotel carpet, but the confident, heavy footsteps of the two wealthy men beside her echoed loudly with undeniable authority. Elias pushed open the massive double doors with one strong, decisive push of his hand. Brilliant crystal chandelier light instantly flooded over them, completely washing away the hallway's dark shadows. They stepped boldly together into the incredibly bright, dazzling heart of the high society celebration. Hundreds of elite, wealthy guests were laughing loudly and drinking expensive vintage champagne in the room. Women were wearing massive diamonds, and men were dressed in sharp designer suits. The air was incredibly thick with the sharp, overwhelming scent of the extravagant white orchids, the very same expensive flowers that Beatrice had quietly paid for with her own back-breaking labor. Elias and Marcus did not hesitate or hide her in the quiet back row of the massive room. They proudly escorted Beatrice directly across the very center of the glittering dance floor. They walked her straight toward the most important, highly visible VIP table in the entire ballroom. It was the exclusive head table, heavily decorated with imported silk and shining silver cutlery. It was the exact place completely reserved for the most honored family members of the wealthy couple. Every single eye in the massive room slowly turned to stare at the incredibly unusual trio. But Elias and Marcus held their heads high, radiating absolute, unapologetic pride for the woman between them. They were about to show New York high society exactly what true, undeniable class really looked like. The Grand Plaza Ballroom was an absolute masterpiece of extreme, unapologetic wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung heavily from the beautifully painted ornate ceilings. They cast a warm, incredibly flattering golden light over the hundreds of elite guests. Waiters in perfectly crisp white coats moved silently between the tables. They carried silver trays loaded with expensive caviar and vintage champagne flutes. The sweet, heavy fragrance of the imported white orchids filled every single corner of the room. It was the exact picture of high society perfection that Nia had always desperately wanted. Then the heavy mahogany doors at the front of the room swung open wide. The quiet murmur of wealthy conversation did not stop immediately. It actually took a few seconds for the elegant crowd to notice the unusual arrival. But when they did, a very strange, rippling wave of silence quickly washed over the room. They saw their highly respected host, the powerful billionaire Elias, walking slowly into the light, and they saw the handsome young groom Marcus, walking confidently right beside his father. But the absolute shock came from the small, bewildered woman walking carefully between them. Beatrice looked incredibly small, surrounded by the vast, glittering expanse of the grand ballroom. She was still wearing her cheap grey polyester housekeeping uniform underneath Marcus's expensive tuxedo jacket. Her heavy rubber-soled work boots looked completely absurd against the highly polished marble dance floor. It was the most extreme, jarring visual contrast you could ever possibly imagine. A tired, stained hotel maid being proudly escorted like royalty through a sea of Manhattan billionaires. You could actually hear the confused, judgmental whispers quickly starting to spread through the elite crowd. Wealthy women leaned in close to their friends, hiding their shocked expressions behind expensive lace fans. Powerful men quietly asked each other why on earth Elias was bringing a dirty worker into the party. They naturally assumed there was some sort of terrible, embarrassing mistake happening right in front of them. But Elias and Marcus did not care at all about the harsh, judging whispers of the crowd. They did not rush or try to quickly hide Beatrice in a dark, quiet corner. They proudly escorted her straight to the very center of the massive room. They walked her directly up to the main head table, which was completely covered in expensive silver. This was the highly exclusive table specifically reserved for the parents of the bride and groom. Marcus pulled out the finest, most ornately carved velvet chair with incredible, genuine respect. He gently guided Beatrice to sit down in the exact spot of absolute highest honor. The judgmental whispers in the room instantly died, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. The entire wealthy crowd realized this was no mistake. This maid was their most important guest. The heavy mahogany doors slowly swung completely shut at the far end of the long corridor. The incredibly loud, joyful music from the Grand Plaza Ballroom was instantly muffled into a dull, distant throb. Nia was left standing entirely alone in the dim shadows right outside the massive double doors of room 714. The thick, heavily perfumed hotel silence suddenly felt incredibly heavy and deeply suffocating against her tight chest. She was wearing a custom silk Vera Wang gown that literally cost more than a luxury sports car. Yet standing completely abandoned in that quiet hallway, she had never felt so incredibly cheap and entirely worthless. She leaned heavily against the expensive floral wallpaper and slowly slid down the wall to the floor. The incredibly delicate layers of imported white silk bunched up awkwardly around her trembling bare knees. Her tear-streaked face was buried deeply in her perfectly manicured, violently shaking hands. She finally opened her swollen red eyes and looked directly at the intricately patterned hotel carpet. The crisp $100 bill was still lying exactly where it had fluttered down to the ground earlier. It was no longer a powerful symbol of her newly acquired elite Manhattan social status. It was just a dirty, crumpled piece of paper, mocking her terrible, heartless choices in the dark. Nia stared blankly at the green money and let the brutal, sickening reality slowly sink into her bones. She had spent her entire adult life running aggressively away from her humble, hard-working Chicago roots. She meticulously erased her past to perfectly fit into the glittering, ruthless world of high society. She painstakingly memorized expensive wine lists, bought exclusive designer labels, and forcefully pushed her own mother into the dark. She honestly believed that creating a flawless, aristocratic illusion would finally make her truly happy and fully accepted. But the real secret is that you cannot build a sturdy, permanent castle on a fragile foundation of cruel lies. Now listen carefully to the heavy, undeniable truth that finally broke her proud spirit into tiny pieces. She had successfully captured the wealthy, handsome groom and the prestigious New York wedding of her wildest dreams. But she had completely lost the only person in the entire world who actually loved her without any conditions. Beatrice had never once asked her brilliant, ambitious daughter to be wealthy or powerful or socially elite. She only ever wanted her beautiful little girl to be safe, healthy, and genuinely happy in a tough world. Nia had brutally traded that pure, rare, unconditional love for a velvet chair at a fancy, superficial dinner table. Through the thick, soundproofed wooden walls, she could hear the sudden, unmistakable sound of loud, roaring applause. She knew exactly what was happening under the bright, sparkling crystal chandeliers right at this very moment. The powerful billionaire Elias was publicly honoring a tired, stained hotel maid in front of his wealthiest peers. Marcus was proudly holding the swollen, calloused hands of the woman who had sacrificed absolutely everything she had. The elite society crowd was currently bowing in deep, quiet respect to the invisible, hard-working foundation of her entire life. And the supposedly perfect, flawless bride was sitting completely forgotten and alone in the hallway dirt. She tightly wrapped her thin arms around her own waist, shivering violently in the cool, air-conditioned draft. Her massive, flawless diamond engagement ring suddenly felt incredibly cold and unbelievably heavy on her trembling finger. She had desperately wanted to prove she was finally better than her painful, struggling, working-class background. She desperately wanted to forcefully scrub away the lingering, sharp smell of industrial bleach and poverty from her skin. But in her vicious, blinding pursuit of upper-class perfection, she became the absolute ugliest, most toxic version of herself. She had turned into the exact kind of heartless, elitist monster she once deeply despised as a child. Nia slowly reached out, a weak, trembling hand, and finally picked up the discarded $100 bill. She clutched the crumpled green paper tightly against her, wildly beating incredibly heavy chest. A fresh, unstoppable wave of hot, bitter tears streamed steadily down her perfectly contoured pale cheeks. There was no wealthy, adoring audience out here, in the dark hallway, to gently comfort her broken ego. There was no expensive, imported floral arrangement that could possibly hide the ugly, rotting stench of her ultimate betrayal. She had finally won the ultimate American dream, but the lonely, isolating victory was completely hollow and entirely meaningless. The Grand Plaza reception finally began to wind down completely. The energetic jazz band quietly packed away their shiny instruments. The wealthy guests slowly filtered out into the cold New York night. Nia walked back into the main ballroom area after hiding for hours. She was no longer the flawless, arrogant bride from earlier this evening. Her custom Vera Wang gown was visibly wrinkled and slightly stained at the hem. Her perfect makeup was washed away by hours of bitter, lonely crying. She looked exactly like a lost, incredibly tired, and deeply broken young girl. She slowly scanned the massive emptying room with swollen red eyes. She fully expected her mother to be completely gone by now. She naturally thought Beatrice would have taken the late subway back to her tiny apartment. But the real secret about a mother's heart is that it rarely follows logical rules. Beatrice was still sitting quietly at the grand VIP head table. She was patiently drinking a simple glass of ice water. She still had Marcus's expensive tuxedo jacket draped warmly over her tired shoulders. Nia walked over to the elegant table with heavy, dragging footsteps. She stopped right in front of the quiet woman she had so brutally rejected. She did not try to make any more pathetic excuses for her terrible behavior. She simply looked down at her own trembling hands in absolute shame. Her exhausted voice broke completely as she offered a quiet, deeply shattered apology. She finally admitted how incredibly toxic and cruel her desperate social climbing had actually been. She begged for a forgiveness she knew she absolutely did not deserve tonight. Anyone else in that exact situation would have rightfully slapped her face. Anyone else would have angrily demanded a humiliating public apology. But here is where it gets incredibly beautiful and deeply profound. Watch closely what this strong mother actually did, instead of seeking revenge. Beatrice slowly stood up from her plush velvet chair and gently closed the narrow distance between them. She did not raise her tired voice or deliver a harsh, bitter lecture. She simply reached out and took both of Nia's trembling hands firmly in her own warm grasp. She looked deeply into her crying daughter's extremely regretful, sorrowful eyes. Beatrice gently explained that true grace is about offering mercy exactly when it is entirely undeserved. She quietly told Nia that a genuine mother's forgiveness is always infinitely larger than a child's worst mistake. She did not instantly erase the heavy pain of the terrible betrayal, but she firmly offered a solid, undeniable bridge back to basic human decency. She gave her sobbing daughter a precious, rare chance to completely start her life over again. She told Nia she absolutely had to learn how to be a decent, honest human being first. She had to completely rebuild her moral compass before ever becoming a wealthy society wife. Marcus and Elias were watching this quiet exchange from the dim shadows near the exit. They silently witnessed the exact moment a deeply broken family actually began to genuinely heal. The heavy toxic armor of high society was finally stripped away for good. Now the real, incredibly difficult work of building a genuine character could officially begin. The extravagant wedding at the Plaza Hotel did not end with a flawless, picture-perfect fairy tale exit. There was no grand staged getaway in a vintage luxury car covered in expensive white roses. The professional photographers did not capture the flawless, artificial smiles Nia had practiced for months. Instead, the cameras captured something infinitely more valuable and incredibly rare in high society. They captured the raw, unfiltered truth of a deeply broken family finally starting to heal. They captured a proud, powerful billionaire pouring a glass of water for a tired housekeeper. They captured a wealthy groom standing firmly beside the humble woman who gave him his bride. Most people might look at that chaotic night and see a massive, humiliating social disaster. They might think that the slightly open door of room 714 ruined a perfectly good marriage. They might assume it violently tore a happy young couple apart, right before their sacred vows. But that is completely missing the actual profound beauty of what really happened in the shadows. The quiet, hidden space outside room 714 did not actually destroy a family that night. It did something much more important and desperately necessary for everyone involved. That dimly lit hotel corridor acted as a brutal, unforgiving mirror for a lost soul. It completely smashed the highly toxic fake shell that Nia had built around her heart. It aggressively tore down the ugly walls of classism and superficial vanity she was hiding behind. Sometimes, you absolutely need a painful, crashing reality check to save your own character. You need your perfectly constructed fake world to burn down so you can see the truth. Nia had to lose her elite social standing to finally find her actual human soul. Now think about the incredible quiet strength of Beatrice in all of this emotional chaos. She never once asked for a single drop of public recognition or high society applause. She only ever wanted to silently protect the beautiful daughter she loved more than life itself. She was willing to remain completely invisible forever if it meant her child was safe. But the universe has a very funny way of rewarding that kind of pure, selfless devotion. The universe made sure her rough, calloused hands were recognized as the most beautiful things in the room. Elias and Marcus also showed us exactly what real, undeniable power actually looks like. They did not use their massive wealth to quietly bury an uncomfortable, ugly family secret. They did not try to sweep the poor, exhausted maid out the back service door. They actively used their immense privilege to elevate the person who deserved it the absolute most. They proved that a custom-tailored suit means absolutely nothing if the man wearing it lacks a spine. They proved that protecting the vulnerable is the ultimate, truest flex of a successful man. Nia still has an incredibly long and deeply painful road of personal growth ahead of her. She has to completely unlearn years of toxic, elitist conditioning and deep, misplaced shame. She has to earn back the sacred trust of the good man who almost walked away. But for the very first time in her life, she is finally walking on solid ground. She is no longer balancing precariously on a fragile, terrifying mountain of desperate lies. She is finally learning how to breathe without the suffocating weight of hiding her own mother. Here is where it gets incredibly interesting for every single one of us watching. Now, listen carefully to the ultimate, inescapable truth buried at the heart of this entire story. We spend so much of our lives desperately chasing things that do not actually matter. We chase shiny luxury brands, exclusive VIP invitations, and the fleeting approval of total strangers. We foolishly think those expensive, hollow things will somehow shield us from feeling inadequate or small. We forget the heavy sacrifices made by the quiet, hard-working people who built our foundation. But true elegance cannot be bought with a black credit card or a massive trust fund. It cannot be acquired by wearing a custom Vera Wang dress or renting a plaza ballroom. The absolute truth of the matter is much simpler and infinitely harder to fake. Class is not about the expensive designer brands you wear on your back. It is entirely about how you treat the people who have absolutely nothing to give you.